Welcome to the next episode of the Influencers series and a look at one of the most significant contributors to the advancement of science and human knowledge, Galileo Galilei. The biography and information presented in this video is extracted from my book in progress, Sins of the Fathers. The Starry Messenger, Galileo's world-shattering publication, opens with a dedication to his Medici patron, Tuscan Grand Duke Cosimo II, followed by a discussion of how only 10 months before publishing his findings, he had heard about the telescope, set out to make his own, and made several prototypes. Over the 2-month period in 1610, noted in the book, starting January 7th and the last recorded observation on March 2nd, Galileo made detailed drawings and notes of the face of the moon during its different phases, the phases of Venus, the stars of the Milky Way, and most critically, discovered the 4 largest moons of Jupiter, which are now referred to as the Galilean moons, with the phases of Venus caused only if it was orbiting the Sun, just as Earth's moon has phases and the orbiting moons of Jupiter. Galileo had evidence that the Earth was not the center of the universe, even if he could not definitively prove that the Earth moved. Galileo signed his dedication to Cosimo on March 12th, and on the 19th, he sent a copy and a telescope to the Grand Duke with a letter that 550 copies had already been printed. Given the elapsed time from first hearing of the telescope to publication, it is easy to envision Galileo thoroughly captivated by what he was seeing each night, and driven by the excitement of his discoveries to publish his remarkable findings as soon as possible. For his efforts, Cosimo named Galileo the philosopher and chief mathematician to the Grand Duke, where he became the tutor to the Medici children, including his future patron, the scientifically gifted Ferdinand II. It was for his observations that Galileo found himself embroiled in a showdown with Catholic authorities several years later. Galileo's observations reinforced but fell short of conclusively proving the Copernican theory. Nevertheless, his evidence was causing quite an upset with scientists and theologians firmly attached to their belief in the traditional Aristotelian Ptolemaic model of an Earth-centric universe, a view which also happened to have several scriptural references to a stationary planet. The head of the Collegio Romano, the Jesuit university in Rome, and the man involved in Bruno's fate, who would also oversee the 1616 trial of Galileo, Cardinal Bellarmine, wrote in March 1611 to 4 distinguished mathematicians under his supervision at the school and asked for confirmation of Galileo's observations. Bellarmine received a response in less than a week that over the past year they had confirmed the observations and that what was being seen was real and not an optical illusion. Things remained relatively calm for the next few years until a series of letters between Galileo and others came to the attention of the Catholic authorities. Starting in late 1613, Christina of Lorraine, Cosimo's mother, asked Benedetto Castelli, who occupied Galileo's former position as head of mathematics at the University of Padua, about the new observations by her son's client. Christina laid out her objections based on the contradictory biblical passages, after which Castelli wrote to Galileo about the encounter. Galileo wrote back with a refutation to the biblical objections, noting that much in the Bible needs to be understood allegorically and not literally. Copies of the letter to Castelli began circulating and inevitably came into the hands of his opponents, so that by February 1615 a copy was sent to the Roman Inquisition. The Inquisition requested an investigation, the results of which determined Galileo's letter did not violate Catholic doctrine, but felt the Copernican inclinations in the Starry Messenger required further study. On February 24, 1616, the investigators issued one of the most controversial and ultimately embarrassing statements in church history, declaring the heliocentric model to be foolish and absurd in philosophy, and formally heretical since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. Maurice Finocchiaro, distinguished professor of philosophy, notes that the Inquisition may have had misgivings about the findings, given that Galileo did not receive a formal condemnation. Instead, Galileo received a private warning from Bellarmine not to hold or defend the heliocentric model. This warning was ordered by the Pope on the 25th of February, and which was duly delivered and agreed to by Galileo on the 26th. While Galileo was not condemned, the other notable event of the proceedings was listing On the Revolutions of Spheres by Copernicus on the index of prohibited books, pending suitable corrections, and the declaration that the heliocentric model be suppressed so that it would not add further to the prejudice of Catholic truth. Galileo requested a letter from Bellarmine outlining the nature of the verbal warning given on February 26th, as some people were claiming Galileo had been formally condemned and he wished to have evidence to the contrary. Galileo received his written confirmation, referred to as Bellarmine's certificate, from the cardinal on May 26th. The wording, defended or held, is the key to what happened next, and as it turned out, it proved extremely serendipitous for Galileo to have requested Bellarmine's certificate. In 1623, Pope Urban VIII came to power, and he was a great admirer of Galileo, and as a then cardinal had played a key role in the 1616 proceedings in preventing the condemnation of Galileo. Finocchiaro notes that there is evidence that Urban did not consider heliocentrism heretical, but that it simply deserved more careful study and discussion. Galileo, noting the new pope's more open-minded attitude and conscious of the instructions not to defend the Copernican model, started working on his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. As several other writers had done before, such as in Cicero's On the Nature of the Gods, Galileo borrowed the motif of presenting controversial topics as a discussion to present and compare the arguments for the Aristotelian, Ptolemaic, and the Copernican solar system models. Using this manner of discussion, Galileo managed to convince the censors that he was not actually holding or defending the heliocentric argument and received their permission to print. Finally, with the patronage of his former student, Grand Duke Ferdinand II, to whom the book was dedicated, it was published in February 1632. This is where things start to get interesting and controversial, as Galileo was subsequently accused of violating the 1616 special injunction against him, an injunction that was neither issued nor applicable given the Pope's own instructions recorded in the Inquisition minutes of February 25th. The Pope had instructed Bellarmine to issue the verbal warning, and only if Galileo refused was the injunction to be issued, in which Galileo was to abstain completely from teaching or defending this doctrine and opinion or from discussing it. Yet, somehow, and contrary to the Pope's recorded directive, the special injunction was in the Inquisition records, dated the same day of the verbal warning, the 26th, which was agreed to, with the warning not to hold, teach, or defend it in any way whatever, either orally or in writing. The legitimacy of the special injunction is a hotly disputed topic, as its existence is not only counter to the Pope's recorded instructions, but it also does not contain Galileo's signature as having received the order, which was standard Inquisition procedure. In 1870, the theory emerged that the injunction was a forgery used by the Inquisition of the 1630s and inserted into the records of the 1616 trial as a pretext for convicting Galileo of having violated its terms. A later theory emerged, given that the writing in the injunction was the same as other Inquisition documents of 1616, that it was indeed a forgery, but one that was created in 1616 as insurance. However, from 1926 to 28, physical tests were performed on the records which determined there was no evidence of tampering, such as erasures or inserted pages, which refuted the thesis of a falsification but stops short of affecting the claim that the injunction is a fake from 1616. By the summer of 1632, Pope Urban established a three-man panel to look into the book. The investigators issued their report in September, which concluded, among other charges, that despite the appearance of a discussion between the two systems, citing that many times in the work there is a lack of and deviation from hypothesis, either by asserting absolutely the Earth's motion and the Sun's immobility, or by characterizing the supporting arguments as demonstrative and necessary, or by treating the negative side as impossible. Based on the report findings, Urban referred the matter to the Inquisition, and Galileo was summoned to Rome to confront his fate. However, Galileo's powerful Medici patron, who helped get the book published, tried to thwart the inevitable, first by requesting the trial be moved to Florence. Finally, in December, the Inquisition issued Galileo with an ultimatum: come on your own terms or in Inquisition chains. On January 20th, 1633, Galileo left Florence for the journey to Rome, where he arrived 3 weeks later and was granted the privilege of living in the Tuscan embassy and not rotting in a Vatican jail, as Bruno had for 7 years. 2 months after arriving, possibly an Inquisition tactic to leave the elderly Galileo to stress about his fate, the first interrogation was held on April 12th. In this first meeting, Galileo admitted to having received the oral warning from Bellarmine, but asserted that the warning still allowed for the theory to be discussed hypothetically, as long as it was neither held nor defended as true. Further, he denied receiving the special injunction with its provision that it could not be discussed at all. Finocchiaro writes there were two surprises at the first meeting: Galileo's surprise at learning of the special injunction, and the Inquisition's at learning of Bellarmine's certificate. The certificate, which Galileo shrewdly requested, effectively neutralized the Inquisition charges that Galileo was never to discuss the Copernican model, leaving the cardinals unsure of what to do next. The Inquisition took another 3 weeks of deliberation to come up with their compromise solution. They would drop the charge of Galileo violating the special injunction, but he would plead guilty to carelessly violating the order not to defend the heliocentric model. On April 30th, Galileo made his second appearance before the tribunal and signed a deposition affirming the lesser charge. On May 10th, Galileo made his third appearance and presented his case, his letter from Bellarmine, his signed confession from April 30th, and begged for mercy. The Inquisition wrote up its findings and presented it to Pope Urban for final approval. However, the Pope was unmoved by Galileo's apparent confession and ordered that Galileo be interrogated again, this time under threat of torture, which was carried out on June 21st. The Pope warned Ferdinand II that the latter would not emerge unscathed from Galileo's trial. Despite being Galileo's patron and student, Ferdinand was also pragmatic and knew that his position was dependent on the goodwill of the papacy, and so he withdrew his patronage and protection. On June 22nd, having lost a powerful benefactor and having been shown the instruments of torture with the knowledge of what had happened to Bruno 33 years earlier, Galileo took the hint and opted for self-preservation over scientific principles. He denied what he knew to be true. Formally charged, Galileo was forced to make a humiliating public statement on the error of his ways. Galileo was ultimately sentenced to house arrest for his remaining years. Banned from pursuing astronomical observations, Galileo returned to what he had done before the telescope landed him in trouble and what he did best: mechanical observations. It was during this last period of his life that he made some of his most impactful contributions, advancements of knowledge and science that ignited the scientific revolution. His last book with these new advances and observations, Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Concerning Two New Sciences, was smuggled out of Italy and published in Holland in 1638. Upon his death in 1642, partly in atonement for turning their back on him, the Medicis planned a public funeral, which the Church forbid. With his passing, the Renaissance era came to an end. In 1992, Pope John Paul II apologized for the Church's treatment of Galileo. However, what is generally not well known were the motivations of the Pope to whitewash history and reframe the sad affair in a positive light for the Church. Given Galileo was a Christian, like the other scholastic mavericks, and Bruno profiled in this series who thought their endeavors to understand the nature of the universe was in the service of proving God, John Paul was eager to emphasize that aspect of Galileo's efforts to prove that there was no conflict between science and religion. So, in 1981, John Paul established the Galileo Commission, containing no experts on Galileo or any non-Catholics, to look into the arguments of the trial that then took 10 years to construct their rationalizations. Given that the Church's authority rests on the premise that it is divinely ordained and therefore infallible, it simply cannot admit that a mistake has been made, as they are boxed in by their own invented doctrines. Instead, the institution forms committees with scores of men who must devote years of their time to inventing explanations that admit, without admitting, that a mistake has been made. The whole charade is patently ridiculous, and the men forced to go through these machinations must be painfully aware of the absurdity of the entire process. In the end, the report ultimately failed to justify the Pope's wishful thinking on the matter, despite John Paul's rhetoric that they show there was no actual gulf between religion and science. What the report did do was to stress that the Inquisition cardinals judging Galileo's work committed an error by failing to recognize that the Bible was not a science book, but a work designed to guide spiritual salvation, which was exactly the point Galileo made in his letters to Castelli and Christina. The report justified this error on the grounds that, in their zeal, the cardinals conflated what evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould coined in 1997 as the non-overlapping magisteria between science and religion. The report further reaffirmed that Galileo also erred as he could not conclusively demonstrate the Earth moved, the standard of proof imposed by Bellarmine in 1616. In short, in an attempt to meet the Pope's agenda by alleviating this stain on church history, the report spread the blame, and despite the papal instructions not to retry the case, the investigators essentially did just that and awkwardly ended up reconfirming Galileo's original conviction. The Pope thanked the Commission for its efforts without acknowledging or accepting its findings and plowed ahead with his mindset that religion and science are not opposed to each other. In John Paul's view, the clash between religion and science was not real, but a fabrication perpetuated by the Enlightenment. In an astounding example of blatant revisionist history, he said in the same 1992 speech that the myth of the divide between religion and science was nothing more than a mutual misunderstanding. This is the apology the Catholic Church purportedly gave to Galileo. Forgive me for refuting the premise that this constitutes an apology, but it's more than they have done for Bruno. If you like my content, please like and subscribe to get notified of new videos. Please also consider supporting my work by becoming a Patreon sponsor. You can also find me on the following platforms.